Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The Galactic Military Academy orbited on Pinnacle Ring like a crown jewel that nobody particularly wanted to wear. 3 decades after humanity stumbled into the interstellar community, half invited, half tolerated, the station represented everything the galaxy thought it understood about warfare. Spoiler alert, it understood almost nothing about how humans processed it. Instructor Nalmeth stood at the front of Tactical History Room 9, his 4 crystalline arms gesturing at the holographic display with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his job, which, honestly, made him either incredibly passionate or slightly unhinged. Possibly both. The Dravixian's translucent skin refracted the light from the display, casting rainbow patterns across the eager faces of his students. Well, most of them were eager. The humans in the back row looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. "Today," Nalmeth announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of academic excitement that made students either lean forward or slump deeper into their seats, "we examine 3 decisive human victories that changed the trajectory of galactic military doctrine: the Proxima standoff, the Void Gate defense, and the reclamation of Outpost Jericho." Lieutenant Juliet sat in the 3rd row, her posture military perfect, her expression carefully neutral. Next to her, Private First Class Dmitri had already started that thing humans did when they wanted to disappear, making himself smaller, eyes forward, "Please don't call on me" energy radiating like a distress beacon. The holographic display shifted, showing fleet formations at Proxima. Gorgeous stuff, really. Tactical brilliance rendered in 3-dimensional glory. Ships moving like a deadly ballet, each maneuver perfectly calculated to... "Instructor Nalmeth?" The clicking, chittering voice of Clickter cut through the presentation. The Rin students' compound eyes reflected the hologram in unsettling multiples. "I have observed something peculiar in my research." Nalmeth's crystalline features arranged themselves into what humans had learned to recognize as pleasure. He loved when students did extra research. "Please, share your observation." Clickter's mandibles clicked in a pattern that the translators rendered as thoughtful consideration. "When the Rin secured the outer mandibles, we built monuments, songs, festivals. When the Dravixians won the border wars, they established memorial weeks, celebrations, educational programs." A pause. "Human victories are barely mentioned in human databases. Few monuments, fewer songs, almost no celebrations. Why?" "Oh, good. This question." Juliet felt every human in the classroom tense simultaneously. It was like watching dominoes prepare to not fall, which was somehow worse than watching them actually fall. Dmitri muttered something under his breath that the translators wisely chose not to interpret. Nalmeth's 4 arms stilled, which anyone who knew Dravixians understood meant genuine curiosity had been triggered. "That is an excellent observation, Clickter. In fact, I have wondered this myself." His eyes, multifaceted like gems, swept across the classroom. "Human students, perhaps you can enlighten us." The silence that followed had weight. Physical, uncomfortable weight. Wisp, one of the floater students, a gaseous being contained in an environmental suit that made them look like a living lava lamp, bubbled with confusion. "Perhaps humans do not value military success?" The translator gave Wisp's voice a gentle, wondering quality. "Maybe they are ashamed," suggested a Mindari student named Ulefone, their telepathic voice manifesting directly in everyone's minds like an intrusive thought. A few alien students nodded, building theories. Humans were modest. Humans were pacifists at heart. Humans didn't understand the importance of morale building through victory celebration. Wrong, wrong, and spectacularly wrong. Juliet could feel Nalmeth's attention settling on her specifically. Damn it. This was what she got for maintaining eye contact like a professional instead of doing the smart thing and pretending to take very important notes. "Lieutenant Juliet," Nalmeth said, his tone gentle but insistent. "You served in the Outer Reaches conflicts. Surely you have perspective on this?" Every human in the room was now studiously looking anywhere but at her. "Thanks, guys. Really feeling the unit cohesion here?" Juliet took a breath. Let it out. Considered her options. Option 1. Deflect with a vague answer about cultural differences. Option 2. Give them the truth and watch the entire class's understanding of humanity shift uncomfortably to the left. "Well," they asked. "We remember different things, instructor," Juliet said, her voice carrying that particular flatness that veterans developed when discussing topics they'd rather set on fire and never mention again. Nalmeth's arms gestured in a pattern that meant, "Please continue." Of course he wanted her to continue. Why wouldn't he want her to continue? This was going to be fun. Fun like root canal surgery performed by an enthusiastic amateur. "Different how?" Clickter clicked, leaning forward with all the innocence of someone about to learn something they couldn't unlearn. Juliet glanced at Dmitri, who gave her a look that clearly communicated, "You started this, you finish it." "Proxima," Juliet began, her voice taking on that storytelling quality that made even the most boring briefing suddenly riveting. Or horrifying. Usually both. The history files call it humanity's brilliant tactical debut, a masterclass in unconventional warfare, the engagement that proved humans belonged in the galactic military community. She paused. "Want to know what we call it?" The classroom was silent. Even the environmental system seemed to quiet down, as if the station itself wanted to hear this. "We call it the Day Commander." Amelia learned that saving 40,000 lives costs exactly 3,000 others. Nalmeth's crystalline skin seemed to dim slightly. "I do not understand." "Amelia commanded the dreadnought Relentless," Juliet continued. "And, yeah," her voice had that edge now, that sharpness that came from talking about things that still had teeth. "When the Ravager fleet came through the Proxima Gate, our forces were outmatched, outgunned, outnumbered. Standard Tuesday for humans, honestly." A few nervous laughs from the human students. Amelia saw the solution immediately. Someone had to hold the gate. Not for victory. Just long enough for the civilian transports to jump to safety. Clickter's mandibles clicked uncertainly. A noble sacrifice. Why would this not be celebrated? "Oh, we absolutely should celebrate," Juliet said, and the sarcasm in her voice could have stripped paint. "We should throw parades for the 3,000 crew members who followed Amelia into that gate, knowing they weren't coming back. We should build monuments to the fact that Amelia's daughter, 19 years old, serving on the frigate Dawnrunner, got to listen to her mother's final transmission while being evacuated to safety." The classroom temperature seemed to drop. "We should definitely celebrate," Juliet pressed on, because apparently she'd decided that if she was doing this, she was doing it properly. That Amelia's last words weren't some inspiring speech. They were, "Tell my girl I'm sorry I'll miss her graduation." Wisp's gaseous form swirled with distress patterns. That is not in the tactical files." "No," Dmitri spoke up, his voice carrying decades of exhaustion despite his relatively young age. "It's not. The tactical files talk about force multiplication, acceptable losses, strategic positioning. They don't mention that acceptable losses have names, families, plans that don't include being vaporized in the Proxima Gate. Uliphone, the Mindari student, tilted their head. But you won. The victory was achieved. The casualties, while regrettable, were within expected parameters for such an engagement. The look Juliet gave them could have curdled milk from 3-star systems away. Expected parameters, she repeated slowly, as if tasting each word and finding them all bitter. Right. Let me explain something about human psychology that apparently didn't make it into your xenopsychology courses. She stood up, and suddenly the casual classroom environment shifted into something else, something harder. We don't see numbers, we see people. She walked to the holographic display, pointing at the Proxima formation. The tactical readout says 3,000 casualties. We see Jenkins, who was getting married next month. We see Thomas, who sent letters to his nephew every week explaining stars. We see Dr. Patricia, who kept her med bay running until the reactor breach and saved 200 lives in the final minutes. Her finger traced the outline of the relentless. We see 3,000 individual human beings who had favorite foods and bad jokes and people waiting for them at home. Nalmeth's 4 arms had gone completely still, a sign of deep contemplation in Dravixian body language. When you ask why we don't celebrate Proxima, Juliet continued, her voice softer now but somehow more intense, it's because every single human who knows that story can picture Amelia's daughter listening to that transmission. We can imagine being her, knowing your mother is about to die, and being utterly powerless to stop it. That's not something you throw a parade about. But surely, Clickter clicked hesitantly, the victory itself has value. The lives saved. Of course it does, Dmitri interjected, standing up as well. Apparently, this was becoming a whole thing. 40,000 civilians made it out because of Amelia's call. That's 40,000 people who got to live, to have children, to grow old. We absolutely acknowledge that. He paused. But here's what you're missing. Humans don't separate the victory from the cost. We can't. It's not how we're wired. He pulled up his sleeve, showing a scar that ran from wrist to elbow. Void Gate Defense. That's the second victory on today's agenda, right, instructor? Nalmeth nodded, his crystalline features unreadable. We won at Void Gate, Dmitri said, and the flatness in his voice was its own kind of terrible. Hooray. We held the line against a force 3 times our size. Brilliant tactical work. The kind of engagement they'll teach in academies for the next century. He traced the scar with his other hand. And all it cost was Jenkins learning to write left-handed, Thomas speaking through a vocoder for the rest of his life, and an entire battalion that never came home. Jenkins and Thomas survived? Wissop asked, confused. That is fortunate. Dimitri's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Sure, they survived. Jenkins can't hold his daughter without his hands shaking from nerve damage. Tomas can't taste food anymore. The vocoder is because his throat was burned away by plasma fire. But hey, they lived. Victory, right? The classroom had gone silent in a way that felt less like quiet and more like shock. Uliphone, the Mindari, spoke telepathically, their mental voice uncertain. May I read your emotional state regarding this? With permission? Dmitri shrugged. Go ahead. Everyone else gets to pretend they understand. Might as well let someone actually see it. The Mindari student's telepathic presence brushed against Dimitri's mind. And? Uliphone physically recoiled. their chairs scraping backward across the floor. I apologize. I apologize. I should not have. The depth of. I did not realize. Yeah, Dmitri said quietly. That's survivor's guilt. That's the feeling that you should have been the one who didn't make it. That's waking up 3 years later still wondering why you're alive when people better than you aren't. He looked at Ulaifon directly. That's what humans carry from our victories. Every single day. Nalmeth had moved to his console, his multiple arms now working with purpose. Holographic displays began appearing, not tactical readouts this time, but something else. Human military databases, memorial records, lists of names, so many names. I am accessing human military commemoration files, Nalmeth said slowly, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't before. Every human victory has an attached. These are not casualty statistics. These are individual profiles, personal histories, next-of-kin notifications. He looked up, his crystalline eyes catching the light. You keep records of everyone. Of course we do, Juliet said simply. How else would we remember them? Clickter's mandibles clicked in a pattern the translators struggled with before settling on confused reverence. Other species build victory monuments. You build memorial walls. Monuments celebrate winning, Dmitri said. Memorials honor sacrifice. There's a difference. The holographic display shifted again, now showing human memorial sites across the galaxy. The Wall of Stars at Luna Base. The Garden of Names on Mars. The Floating Remembrance at Jupiter Station. Each one listing thousands upon thousands of names. Not battles, not victories, just names. I begin to understand, Nalmeth said quietly, why humans seem uncomfortable during victory celebrations hosted by other species. Juliet let out a breath that was half laugh, half something darker. Uncomfortable. That's diplomatic. Try standing in a hall while everyone celebrates a battle you fought in, and all you can think about is the empty chairs at the post-battle briefing. Try smiling for the cameras while remembering what your friend looked like when the med team finally gave up. She shook her head. We're not trying to be rude. We're just haunted by different ghosts than you are. The Academy's chronometer chimed, indicating the class period was halfway through. Usually, Nalmeth would transition to the next tactical case study at this point. He didn't move. I have taught this course for 15 cycles, he said finally. I have presented these human victories as exemplars of tactical innovation. I have never. He paused, all four arms gesturing helplessly. I never asked what they cost. Not truly. Not like this. Most species don't, Juliet said, not unkindly. It's not a criticism. Different species process warfare differently. Some of you celebrate victory because the act of surviving against odds deserves recognition. We get that. We can't separate the survival from who didn't survive with us. The classroom had taken on the atmosphere of a funeral, which was probably appropriate given the topic. Nalmeth's crystalline form seemed duller somehow, as if the conversation had physically dimmed him. He looked at his carefully prepared lesson plan. 3 human victories, tactical analysis, strategic implications, and apparently decided to throw the entire thing into the nearest airlock. I need to understand this fully, he said, his 4 arms folding in a gesture of complete attention. Lieutenant Juliet, you mentioned Commander Amelia at Proxima. Help me understand what the historical record misses. Juliet sighed. Of course he wanted details, because apparently today was the day they ripped open old wounds for educational purposes. The average age of the human fleet at Proxima was 22 years old, she began. 22? That's barely old enough to drink in some human cultures. And we had them commanding warships. Youth does not diminish tactical capability, Klikter observed. No, Dmitri cut in, but it does mean that most of those 3,000 crew members on the Relentless had parents who outlived them. You know what's fun? 40,000 survivors means 40,000 people who got to live. It also means roughly 1,200 parents who buried children. Do the math on that, and tell me how we're supposed to celebrate. Wispy's gaseous form swirled with distress. But surely Commander Amelia's sacrifice was honored. There must have been recognition? Oh, there was recognition, Juliet said, and the bitterness in her voice was thick enough to choke on. Amelia got the Star of Valor, posthumously. Highest military honor humanity awards. Beautiful ceremony. Her daughter got to accept it on her behalf. She paused. Want to know what her daughter did with it? The silence suggested that maybe they didn't want to know, but they were going to find out anyway. She melted it down and had it forged into 3,000 small pins. Sent one to every family member of every crew member who died on the Relentless. Each pin engraved with a single word. Together. Juliet's voice cracked slightly. Because her mother's last act wasn't about glory. It was about making sure those 3,000 people didn't die alone and forgotten. Nalmeth had gone completely still. All 4 arms frozen in positions that suggested his entire processing system had just experienced a significant error. That is, I have no cultural context for that level of pain, Dmitri supplied helpfully. Guilt? The overwhelming need to make sure every single person is remembered because forgetting them would be worse than dying yourself? All of those, Nalmeth admitted. Ulefon, the Mindari student, spoke telepathically, their mental voice cautious. In my culture, we experience shared consciousness during combat. We feel each other's deaths. It is traumatic, but we process it communally, and then we release it. To hold on to that pain seems... They paused. Forgive me, but it seems counterproductive to operational effectiveness. Juliet laughed, sharp and humorless. Counterproductive. Right. You know what else is counterproductive? Not caring. Treating people like statistics. Forgetting that. Every tactical decision has a human cost. She leaned forward. You want to know why human commanders are so stubborn about minimizing casualties? Why we'll spend hours finding solutions that don't involve acceptable losses? It's because we know we'll have to live with every face we sacrifice. We can't just release it and move on. But that must be psychologically devastating, Klikter clicked, mandibles working in agitation. It absolutely is, Dmitri confirmed cheerfully. Human military psychology divisions are the most well-funded departments in our entire defense structure. Because, yeah, carrying this weight breaks people. Regularly. We have entire facilities dedicated to helping veterans process the fact that they survived when others didn't. He gestured at himself. 3 years of therapy, and I still can't sleep through the night without seeing Void Gate. The Void Gate defense. Right. The second victory on today's agenda. Nalmeth seemed to gather himself, his crystalline skin brightening slightly. Perhaps we should examine Void Gate then. The tactical files describe it as a textbook defensive operation. Outnumbered forces holding a strategic position through superior coordination and morale. Superior coordination and morale, Dmitri repeated slowly. That's one way to describe watching your friends die while you can't do anything to stop it. He moved to the holographic display, pulling up the Void Gate formation, the beautiful tactical formation that looked so clean and precise in 3-dimensional rendering. See this defense line? Third Squadron holding the eastern approach, he pointed. That's where Jenkins was. Plasma fire came through the shield gaps. Design flaw nobody caught until people started dying from it. Jenkins survived because he was short enough that the blast went over his head. The two people standing next to him weren't. Wisp made a sound that the translators interpreted as distressed bubbling. Jenkins spent the next 6 hours fighting with his hands shaking so badly he could barely aim, Dmitri continued, his voice taking on that distant quality of someone narrating trauma. But he kept fighting. You know why? Not because he was brave, because stopping meant thinking about what he'd just seen, and thinking about it meant breaking down. And breaking down meant people who were counting on him would die. That is a form of courage, Nalmeth said quietly. That's a form of horror, Dmitri corrected. Courage is facing danger willingly. What Jenkins did was compartmentalize trauma in real time, so he could function long enough to survive. There's a difference. Juliet stood up again, moving to stand beside Dmitri. The thing about Void Gate that never makes it into the tactical files is the sound. Human ships have audio pickups throughout the hull for damage assessment. Every hit, every breach, every explosion gets recorded. She looked directly at the alien students. So do the screams. The Tua classroom had gone from funeral quiet to morgue silent. Medical Officer Thomas kept the emergency channel open during the fighting, Juliet said. Standard protocol. Lets scattered units coordinate casualty response. But it also meant that everyone heard everything. Every call for help. Every person dying. Every medic trying to save someone and failing. Her jaw tightened. Tomas's vocal cords were destroyed, trying to coordinate rescue operations while his own medical bay was on fire. The vocoder isn't because he got injured in combat. It's because he screamed himself hoarse, trying to save people, and inhaled plasma fire doing it. Clickter's compound eyes reflected the hologram in ways that suggested the Rin student was deeply uncomfortable. You are saying that your victory at Void Gate is inseparable from these personal tragedies? Not tragedies, Dmitri said firmly. Costs. Calling them tragedies makes it sound like accidents. These were choices, tactical decisions. Someone, multiple someones, looked at the situation and decided that holding Void Gate was worth the price we paid. He crossed his arms. They were right. Strategically, holding that gate saved millions of lives across 3 systems. But being right doesn't make it hurt less. Nalmeth had pulled up more human records, his multiple arms working across different displays. I am seeing a pattern in human after-action reports. Every tactical success is followed by what you call a memorial review, not a celebration, not a promotion ceremony, a memorial review. Standard human military protocol, Juliet confirmed. After every engagement, before anything else happens, the commanding officer reads every single name of everyone who didn't make it. Out loud, in front of the survivors. She met Nalmeth's multifaceted eyes. It's not optional. It's not symbolic. It's mandatory. Because we decided a long time ago that nobody gets to be an acceptable loss. They all get to be remembered personally by the people who led them. That seems, Clickter searched for words, emotionally brutal for commanders. It is, Juliet agreed. Good. Commanders should feel brutal emotional weight when people die under their command. It keeps us honest, keeps us from making decisions that waste lives. Her voice hardened. The moment a commander stops feeling that weight is the moment they stop being fit to lead humans. Ulaifon's telepathic voice manifested, hesitant and thoughtful. I am beginning to understand. You do not celebrate victories because doing so would require you to forget the cost, and forgetting the cost would be a betrayal of those who paid it. Now you're getting it, Dmitri said. Every human victory is built on sacrifice. Real, personal, individual sacrifice. We can acknowledge the tactical success while still carrying the weight of who we lost achieving it. They're not separate things for us. They can't be. Nalmeth's crystalline form had dimmed again, but this time it seemed less like diminishment and more like contemplation. "I have been teaching these battles wrong," he said quietly. "For 15 cycles, I have been teaching them wrong." Before anyone could respond to Nalmeth's admission, the classroom door opened with a pneumatic hiss that made everyone jump, which was ridiculous. Doors opened all the time. But the emotional tension in the room had reached levels where even normal sounds felt ominous. The man who entered was old by human military standards, which meant he'd survived things that should have killed him and hadn't retired because the job wasn't done. Admiral Thomas walked with the careful precision of someone whose body had been rebuilt multiple times, but whose spine remained stubbornly unbreakable. 3 prosthetic limbs, visible interface ports along his jawline, and eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it. "Instructor Nalmeth," Thomas said, his voice carrying that particular gravelly quality that came from screaming orders over weapons fire for decades. "I was informed you were discussing human military victories. Thought I'd observe, if you don't mind." Nalmeth's 4 arms gestured welcome, though his crystalline features suggested he wasn't entirely sure whether this was helpful or about to make everything significantly more complicated. "Admiral Thomas, your timing is actually quite relevant. We were just discussing why humans don't throw parades," Thomas finished, moving to lean against the wall near the back of the classroom. "Yeah, I heard. Word travels fast on an orbital station, especially when human students start explaining things that make alien cadets question their entire understanding of warfare." Clickter's mandibles clicked nervously. "Admiral, we meant no disrespect. We were simply curious about cultural differences in victory commemoration." "No disrespect taken," Thomas said, though his expression suggested he was evaluating every student in the room with the same tactical assessment he'd probably use on potential threats. "Curiosity is good. Means you're thinking. Question, though, did anyone bring up Jericho yet?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Dmitri and Juliet exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations in silence. Finally, Juliet spoke. "We hadn't gotten there yet, sir." "Good," Thomas said, though his tone suggested it was anything but good. "Because Jericho is where the conversation gets really uncomfortable." Wisp's gaseous form swirled with cautious interest. Outpost Jericho is considered humanity's most celebrated victory. The historical records describe it as a masterpiece of defensive warfare and relief operations. Thomas's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Celebrated. Right. Let me tell you about celebration." He pushed off from the wall, moving to the holographic display, with the methodical grace of a predator. "Nalmeth, pull up the Jericho tactical files." The display shifted, showing the remote outpost on the edge of contested space. A small facility, strategically positioned, defended by 800 human personnel against a Ravager force that should have crushed them in hours. 11 days, Thomas said quietly. 800 defenders held for 11 days against a force 20 times their size. By the time my relief fleet arrived, we'd lost 704 people. He paused. We found 96 survivors. Half of them didn't survive their injuries. The math on that was horrifying. The silence in the classroom reflected this. The tactical analysis calls it a brilliant defense, Thomas continued, his voice taking on an edge like broken glass. Inspired use of limited resources, creative tactical solutions, indomitable human spirit. He turned to face the class. Want to know what I call it? Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to answer. I call it the worst thing I've ever seen, Thomas said flatly. And I've seen a lot of bad things. I found Dr. Natalia in what was left of the medical bay. She'd amputated her own leg, to free herself from debris so she could keep treating wounded soldiers. Worked for 3 days with a tourniquet and whatever painkillers she could scrounge before she passed out from blood loss. Click-ter made a sound that the translators struggled with before settling on horrified clicking. Natalia survived, Thomas added, if you're wondering. Lives with chronic pain and a prosthetic that doesn't quite interface correctly because we had to fit it in a hurry. But she survived, so that's a win, right? The sarcasm could have etched steel. She still practices medicine, still volunteers for frontline posts. You know what she told me when I asked why? Ulaifon's telepathic voice was barely a whisper. What did she say? She said, because if I stop, that means what happened at Jericho broke me, and I refuse to let those 700 people have died for nothing. Thomas's jaw tightened. That's not courage. That's trauma weaponized into motivation. There's a difference. Nalmeth had gone completely still, watching Thomas with an intensity that suggested every word was being catalogued and reassessed against 15 cycles of teaching. Admiral, the tactical files indicate your relief force arrived at the optimal strategic moment. The timing was 3 days late, Thomas interrupted, his voice going cold in a way that made the environmental systems seem warm by comparison. I could have been there 3 days earlier. The classroom went from silent to suffocating. I don't understand, Wissop said carefully. If you could have arrived earlier, why? Because 3 days earlier, I was evacuating 50,000 civilian refugees from the outer colonies, Thomas said, and the weight in his voice could have crushed planets. 3 days routing my fleet to civilian transports, loading non-combatants, protecting them from Ravager, scouts, getting them to safety. He looked directly at Wisp. I chose the refugees. 50,000 civilians or 800 soldiers. The math is simple. That is the correct tactical decision, Click-ter clicked uncertainly. Of course it's the correct decision, Thomas snapped, and the sudden flash of anger made several students flinch. It's the right decision. The moral decision. The decision that saves the most lives. He took a breath, visibly controlling himself. It's also the decision that cost 400 of Jericho's defenders their lives. 400 people who died in those 3 days while I was busy making the right choice somewhere else. Juliet had gone pale. Dmitri looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The rest of the human students had expressions that suggested they'd heard versions of this story before, and it never got easier. You want to know why we don't celebrate Jericho? Thomas asked, his voice dropping to something raw and painful. Because I have to live with the knowledge that I made the right call, and people still died because of it. Because the 96 survivors know, they know, that if I'd arrived 3 days earlier, hundreds of their friends would still be alive. And they're right. They are absolutely right. But you saved 50,000 civilians, Ulifon protested telepathically. The alternative would have been worse, Thomas agreed. I know. I've run the numbers. I've played the scenarios. Every simulation, every analysis confirms I made the correct decision. his prosthetic hand clenched into a fist. Doesn't make it hurt less. Doesn't mean I don't see the faces of those 400 people every time I close my eyes. Doesn't mean the survivors look at me without wondering what if. He turned back to the holographic display, where Jericho's final defensive positions were still rendered in clean, tactical perfection. The data says 96 survivors. What it doesn't say is that 43 of them killed themselves within 5 years. Survivor's guilt, they called it. Combat trauma. The inability to process why they lived when so many others didn't. The horror on the alien students' faces was universal, transcending species barriers. The thing about impossible choices, Thomas continued, his voice quieter now but somehow more devastating, is that being right doesn't make them stop being impossible. I saved 50,000 people. I lost 400 soldiers. Both of those facts are true simultaneously. Both of those facts live in my head, fighting each other, every single day. Nalameth's crystalline skin had gone almost transparent, a sign of deep emotional processing in Dravixian physiology. Admiral, I do not know what to say. Nobody does, Thomas said. That's kind of the point. You ask why humans don't celebrate victories? Because every victory is built on a foundation of people who should be here celebrating with us. Because we carry their weight, not metaphorically, not symbolically. We actually carry it. Every single day. He looked around the classroom, meeting the eyes of every student, human and alien alike. The survivors of Jericho don't celebrate the fact that they held the line. They mourn the fact that holding the line cost 700 lives. When I visit the memorial wall at Jericho Station, I don't see a tactical victory. I see 704 names, people I failed to save fast enough. You didn't fail, Juliet said quietly. Sir, with respect, you made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances. You saved 50,000 lives. I know, Thomas said, and the exhaustion in his voice was absolute. Doesn't make me feel better about the 400 I didn't save. That's the burden of command. That's what every human officer carries. The knowledge that sometimes right and wrong aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same decision viewed from different angles. The classroom had transcended uncomfortable and landed somewhere in the territory of emotionally devastating, which, honestly, was probably appropriate for a conversation about why humans treated victory like a funeral instead of a celebration. Then, something unexpected happened. Nalmeth's crystalline form began to brighten, not with happiness, but with something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. His forearms moved in patterns that suggested deep agitation. I need to tell you something, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. Something I have never told my students. Never told anyone at this academy. He paused, all forearms trembling slightly. I am a veteran of the Dravixian border wars. That got everyone's attention. We won those wars, Nalmeth continued, his voice gaining strength. Decisive victories. Strategic brilliance. My people celebrate the border wars with festivals, songs, educational programs. His crystalline skin dimmed. I have never attended a single celebration. Not one. In 30 cycles, I have avoided every festival, every memorial service, every victory commemoration. Click-Tur's mandibles clicked in confusion. But instructor, why would you? Because I remember their faces, Nalmeth said, and the pain in his voice was suddenly, shockingly familiar. Every Dravixian I commanded who did not return. Every tactical decision that saved hundreds, but cost dozens. Every time I gave an order that I knew would result in casualties. He looked at Thomas. I thought I was broken. I thought something in my psychology had failed. My culture celebrates victory. I cannot. I thought I was defective. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding crackling between species like electricity. "You're not defective," Thomas said quietly. "You're just carrying weight your culture doesn't acknowledge. Doesn't mean the weight isn't real." Nalmeth's forearms gestured helplessly. "How do you bear it? How do humans function while carrying this constantly?" "Badly," Dmitri said with dark humor. "We bear it badly. That's why human military psychology is a major industry. We don't have some secret technique. We just acknowledge the pain exists and try to survive it." The classroom door opened again. Apparently today was the day for unexpected visitors, and a Rin warrior entered. Old, missing 3 of his 6 limbs, carapace scarred in ways that spoke of combat too close and too brutal. He moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body had betrayed him, but whose will remained intact. "I heard," the Rin said, his clicking translated as gravelly and weathered, "that humans were finally explaining. I had to come." More figures appeared in the doorway. A Mindari with visible neural damage scarring. A floater whose containment suit showed repair marks from decades of use. A Dravixian with 2 missing arms. Veterans, all of them, from multiple species, all looking at the human students with expressions that transcended language. "My hive celebrates our victories," the old Rin warrior said, moving into the classroom with painful slowness. "Songs, monuments, festivals. I cannot attend them. I thought—" His mandibles clicked in a pattern suggesting pain. "I thought I was the only one who remembered wrong, who felt wrong." The Mindari veteran's telepathic voice manifested, shaky and uncertain. "I cannot shield myself from the memories of those I failed to save. My people process trauma communally and release it. I cannot release. I thought my telepathic abilities were damaged. I lost my entire squadron protecting me," the floater whispered through their translator. "They chose to die so I could escape. My people say I should honor their sacrifice by living fully. But living fully feels like betrayal when they cannot live at all." Thomas straightened, his military bearing snapping into place as he recognized what was happening. "How many of you are out there?" "Many," the Rin warrior clicked. Word spread through the veteran networks. Humans finally explaining why victory hurts. "We had to come. Had to know if—" He paused. "Had to know if we were alone." Nalmeth had moved to the doorway, looking out into the corridor. His crystalline form reflected dozens of figures, veterans from species across the galaxy, all converging on this classroom, all carrying weight their cultures didn't acknowledge, all thinking they were broken because they couldn't celebrate. "This is unprecedented," Nalmeth whispered. "This is necessary," Thomas corrected. He turned to address the growing crowd. "How many of you thought you were defective because you couldn't celebrate your victories?" Every single veteran in that corridor raised a hand, limb, or appendage. The universality of it was staggering. Juliet felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, but opening. "You're not defective," she said, her voice carrying. "You're not broken. You're just carrying weight that matters. The people you lost matter. The choices you made matter. Feeling that weight doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." She paused. "Well, not literally human. But you understand what I mean." A few weak laughs rippled through the crowd. "I gave an order 30 cycles ago," the Dravixian veteran said, moving into the classroom. "An order that saved thousands, but killed dozens. I can still see their faces. My people tell me to focus on the thousands saved. I cannot stop seeing the dozens lost. That's not a flaw in your programming, Dmitri said. That's empathy. That's understanding that every life has value, even when tactics require sacrifice, especially when tactics require sacrifice. The old Rin warrior made his way to the holographic display, looking at the tactical renderings with compound eyes that had seen too much. We thought we were alone, each of us in our separate species, carrying this weight and thinking we were the only ones who felt it. You were never alone, Thomas said firmly. You just didn't have a framework to understand what you were feeling. Human culture acknowledges this weight. We built our entire military psychology around it. Not because we're better, because we paid a terrible price learning the lesson. Nelmeth's 4 arms were moving in patterns of revelation. This is why human veterans integrate so well into other species' forces. Not because of tactical skill, because you understand the emotional cost in ways we have not been taught to acknowledge. We understand that winning hurts, Juliet agreed. We understand that doing the right thing doesn't make it stop being painful. We understand that you can be proud of the outcome while still mourning the cost. A young cadet, alien species indeterminate from the back of the crowd, spoke up hesitantly. Admiral Thomas, you said you made the right choice at Jericho, but it still hurts. How do you reconcile that? How do you live with being right and being in pain simultaneously? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried decades of hard-won wisdom. You don't reconcile it. You carry both truths. I saved 50,000 civilians. That's true and good. 400 soldiers died while I made that choice. That's also true and painful. Both facts exist. Both facts matter. He looked at the young cadet directly. The moment you stop feeling pain about the cost is the moment you stop being fit to make these decisions. The pain keeps you honest, keeps you from treating lives as statistics. But surely, Clickter clicked uncertainly, there must be a way to process the pain and move forward? To heal? You don't heal from it, the Mindari veteran said telepathically. You learn to carry it. The weight becomes part of you, part of who you are, part of why you keep fighting. So fewer people have to carry weight like this. Dmitri nodded. Every human veteran I know carries ghosts, people they couldn't save, choices they regret, moments they'd change if they could. We don't get over it. We get through it. There's a difference. The crowd in the corridor had grown. Veterans, yes, but also younger soldiers, cadets, instructors, all listening to this conversation that was rewriting their understanding of what victory actually meant. Nalmeth moved to stand beside Thomas, his crystalline form reflecting both the Admiral and the growing crowd. For 30 cycles, I have carried this weight alone, thinking I was broken, thinking I had failed somehow to process victory correctly. His voice cracked. For the first time since the border wars ended, I feel not healed, but understood. Understanding is where healing starts, Thomas said quietly. You don't need to celebrate. You need to remember. And remembering together is better than celebrating alone. The old Rin warrior's mandibles clicked in a pattern the translators rendered as profound gratitude. My hive will not understand this. They will still celebrate. They will still build monuments to victory. Let them, Juliet said. Different species process warfare differently. That's fine. But you don't have to feel broken because you process it differently than your culture expects. You're allowed to remember. You're allowed to hurt. You're allowed to carry the weight. We're allowed to carry it together, the Dravixian veteran added, moving to stand with Nelmeth and Thomas. Something was happening. Something organic and unstoppable. Veterans from across the galaxy, from dozens of species, were gathering in the Academy's corridors, not to celebrate, not to forget, to remember together. By evening, the Academy's Grand Hall, usually reserved for ceremonies and formal events, had filled with over 300 veterans from across the galaxy.